Hello again. I'm just going to kick it off, and I'm going to be pretty much reading from what I've written before. I just find that way easier. I've been finding that nowadays it's almost impossible to hold anything down for a period of time. Whereas once assured on how I defined myself when I was making art or design, I'm less sure now. It keeps changing, or at least it just seems to shift with whatever I'm doing, and all I can often do or say is, I guess that's just the way things go. It's been an unusual 3 months or so since I started a residency here. I came here with very little idea of exactly what I wanted to do. To be honest, I was surprised when this actually ended up happening. A similar thing happened at the start of this year when I was approached by North Projects, a gallery back home in New Zealand, to be the second artist in residence. My mind was fairly blank at this time, still in that post-art school bewilderment. Plus it was summer. I said yes, but that I'd need some time to think about what I actually wanted to do. The time came around and I gave a non-committal statement of intent. I told the curators that I would write. But when I sat down to write, I feel like I had very little or nothing to say. I've been used to writing focused research pieces, critiques, and a lot about design and design history. But I've just done 4 years of that. Sitting there, I found myself lost for ideas. The writing usually comes second after a period of research and digestion. Now I was just sitting there in a white room with no prior content. New Zealand was playing cricket against Sri Lanka at the time, so I put that on. I took a drive out over the hills to the city's port, and I began picking up little threads of ideas that had sat in the back of my mind, and I started spinning. And I mean in the way that a vacuum cleaner spins, sucking up what's underneath its feet. Things that were close to my mind became the content that I'd been searching for. I began pulling in things like the ship of Theseus, beach glass, languages based on symbols, libraries, fiction, films, and cricket writing. In the process, the vortex also grabbed a few friends who I'd interacted with during the time. So something grew out of nothing, or maybe something condensed out of everything. I titled this project Bay Construction in the Cash Museum. I like to imagine myself creating a mental harbour in which water and boats could be examined, the water being the ever-changing body of knowledge with the boats' visible points upon it. And through these loosely connected paragraphs that I was writing, I was creating a museum of a stored sort of thing that was archived and saved for later, backed up maybe. I ended up printing these on A4 sheets of paper and just bundling it all together in a loose form. This residency has been very similar in process to that one, and excuse me for gazing into my own navel, I think if I dig around in there enough, I can really touch on the themes of the symposium, or at least the things that I had hoped that it would be themes. Content creation and definitions of practice. So I returned to the start of the residency here. Having established this way of finding content, I again rummaged for what's around my head. I sat back in the excavator, ready to begin reshaping the bay, and started spinning the threads. I did a short introduction to other members of the office here, not too long after the start of the residency, and this slide is taken from that. I picked up on thoughts of location, mapping, and communication, all coming back quite naturally due to my still fresh move from Christchurch, New Zealand to Chicago, USA. Back at university, I tried to understand this vortex-like practice in a different way. I used 3 overlapping headings, designing, editing, and writing, not too dissimilar to something that James uses in his own practice. I arranged these circles, looking for this bleed space where I thought that the most interesting work came out of. Looking at it again, I want to try and apply thinking to it that if I spun them fast enough, they'll blend into one. Just like in science class, when the teacher spins the red, green, and blue wheel fast enough for the whole wheel to turn white. I am the spinning, always trying to find the right speed. I think that this notion of the vortex is quite relatable to the process of editing. That the material I exhibit and publish already exists in the world, but I simply guide one to see these. Perhaps this is where personality comes into my vein of making. I might also bring this back to the notion of constructing the bay, bringing into my body of knowledge and then picking up points to float on the water. I use these words as starting points from which I can... these ones here, from which I could start to spin and weave together. From these loose beginnings, I tuned into 4 major projects. The first, documenting the area that we're in. 2, flags. 3, the chance connection between a World War II air serviceman, a German crash historian, and myself. And 4, the Symposium. So now we come to that question of how I bring these things into the real world. Of course, when making anything, it's important to know where it's going to go, who it's for, your reasons for creating it, the desired effect of this thing on said audience. Usually fairly simple questions, these become blurred somewhat when creating work that blends disciplines and emerges from the grey, or if we want to keep trying to make the spinning analogy work, white areas. I was hesitant to say that I'm settled in any kind of a groove, but that I do gravitate towards printed media, and in particular the publication form. This to me feels like the grooviest of mediums. This is probably because I like writing, editing, and the designing process. I wonder then if I'm making books and because I have a design background, then I'm making design work. Am I working just within the design medium? Are books a design medium, or are they literary? What of artist books, limited edition prints, photo books, archival books, novels, poetry? Is the giving of form making a book a design process? Again, I find myself wrestling with the same language barriers. As a blank, I blank. As a designer, I make books. Yes, that feels right. But when I put my work into literary, art, and historical discourses, this also feels right. Is describing my work as a part of each of these, simply utilizing different vocabularies? In turn, however, these terms colour the way that the work might be approached. Are we looking at different things when I say that my work is a design work or it's an artwork? The language is like the viewing platform to my bay. From different angles, it looks different. Some boats are more visible than others, and the sun reflects differently off the waves. I was interested in creating questions for the symposium that poked at the finding or creating of content within work. That could be the writing, the history, the images, the forms, the grids, whatever it is that the work comprises of, the way that this comes about, and how it is then presented, distributed, and received. But here we go again, scratching at language. Let's look at something real, something that we can nail down maybe. I've been working on all three of the main publishing residency projects at the same time, the walk, the flags, and the crash. The first and only one that currently exists tangibly is Free Hugs, if you do a burnout. Which you can grab out of the box just by the door, if you haven't seen it already. This emerged first from frustration that I didn't have any satisfactory point to leap from, or that I wanted to show. I drew a border on Google Maps around this area and I set out for a walk. Along the way I took photos to document these spaces. And there were no real visual rules that I had intended to use, and I hadn't really intended to make these images into anything. Getting back to the studio, I printed them out and roughly cut the pages, grabbed what pens I could find by the printer, and started writing, drawing, and scrawling on the images. This was a very immediate response, driven by the desire to have something made, something tangible to work from. And it was this very immediate personal response that I wanted in the work. This was part of the constructing. From this, I then selected images and parts of drawings and put them together with small bits of text. And now let me pause here. Why did I put it into book form? Was it because I associate with designly thinking or heritage? Again, it's hard to say. I wanted to create a work that revealed itself slowly to the viewer, that unfolds and unravels. There's also a space that I feel comfortable working within, and that I have an established line of inquiry to build upon. Here I spun, pulling in the notions of location, travel, place, and displacement. I constructed, adding myself into these, and I found content. And I gave the viewer a port of access through this book. Writing this, I got stuck here. Where was the design in this equation? I came back with multiple answers, all dependent on how we define design. Design is production, design is an act of editing, design is decision-making, design is inquiry, design is culture, design is strategy, design is problem-solving. And again, I'm scratching at terminology. It's always going to be problematic, I tell myself, and that's just the way that things go. Let's look at something else. Maybe I can tease out what I'm trying to find here. Earlier this year, the current New Zealand government began the process of changing the national flag. They created a flag consideration panel, passed legislation to organise referendums, and invited the public to submit designs. Of the 10,292 flags, the panel narrowed the list down to 4, now 5 after a social media push for another, to be voted on. You can see the current flag up the top there, and the 5 to be put to vote below. An initial period of voting on the 5 begins tomorrow. The selected flag from that will be put against the current flag. This process had been weighing on my mind a lot before the residency. There was a feeling of hopelessness in the face of such a large-scale government move. There was plenty of critique from just about everyone, and it seemed that everyone had an opinion. Now, can I ask here, if everyone who submitted a design is a designer, why does that sound wrong? Why doesn't the bloke who made the kiwi with laser beam eyes, or the sheep in the hokey pokey ice cream flag made an MS Paint count? Is there a skill ceiling or a type of developed visual thinking that makes one a designer? And I feel like we already addressed this earlier on.
Which one was?
Did they pick one?
Yeah. Which one was put forward by the social media campaign?
The one that was put forward by the social media campaign was this triangle one.
A triangle. Okay.
Yeah.
I would have guessed the squirrel for some reason.
Yeah, like there are very obvious Kiwiana things that are being pushed by the current Prime Minister as well. But that's a whole other like So we're stuck again. I tried designing my own flags as a response, but these felt empty. No, I wanted to spin out what was underneath the idea of a flag. I was skipping the first two steps. It was like in order to return to the form of a flag, I had to first find the abstract, filter it, and build upon it. I wanted a flag that responded to similar feelings as in free hugs, and carried within it subtle critiques. The sky flags come as a response. With my friend and fellow designer Jessica Tabke, Lisa in here, we photographed the sky over a period of 2 weeks above our locations, Christchurch, New Zealand and Chicago, USA. I then averaged these to produce 2 singularly coloured flags. Before photographing the sky, I wrote this. The blue flag is designed to reflect the world around it. However, it only occasionally blends into its environment. It might be the middle ground, the average. The blue flag isn't truly blue. It might act as a reference point among the surrounding landscape. One might identify a place by locating the flag first and tracing the line down from sky to earth. The blue flag might be an act of logging and archiving. The image of the flag itself might be a logotype. The blue flag might be a skeleton. When its camouflage is successful, one might only see the pole. The empty flagpole might be seen as a political act, the taking of no sides, the lack of identity. The blue flag has the potential to be an ongoing, ever-evolving material, the flying representing the specific location and time of the flyer. When 2 flags are flown on separate poles, there is a conversation, you and I, us and them, now and then, here and there. I spun, I found the flags, I constructed, I found the content of identity, place, and markers. I give the viewers access through the form of the flag and what soon might become another photo book containing the photographs and weather information. Note now that the flags are currently being made and that these screens are taken from flagtest.nz, a site developed to view submitted flags as if they were flying in a harsh southerly breeze. The final project is another zine, which I'll be printing in about a week's time. On the 19th of February 1944, Englishman Maurice Askew, engineer aboard the A. Able Lancaster bomber, found himself abandoning the aircraft after it was shot down over Germany. He was then taken as a prisoner of war. In 2013, while researching the history of graphic design course at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, I met Maurice, who had emigrated in order to set up the course in 1960. In August this year, Volker Urbanski found the exact crash site of the A. Able. Here he is pictured with Mr. Stover. I was contacted by Volker over Facebook. I had recently mentioned Maurice in a text I wrote about design history, and I managed to put the two in contact. This is Volker on the left here, and Mr. Stover, who was the witness of the crash. Fascinated by this coincidence and by Volker's hobby, I have been interviewing him and collating materials that described a series of events. In this case, most of the material already exists and I am working as more of a curator of it, but still there is the underlying spinning up to this, a kind of selection from all possible projects, and then there is the construction and curation of the materials, and of course the presenting to be viewed by printed pages. Whereas the design here, is curating a design-only act? Of course the book design can be identified as a design act. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, does my background and the decision to present in book form change the way I approach the content? When I attended the New York Art Book Fair's Contemporary Artist Book Conference, I found there was a constant use of the trope, as a blank, I a blank. It was very much used as a statement of authority. As a designer, I can say this about the work. As an archivist, I have this to offer. As a librarian, I can say this. And although my initial reaction is negative towards these statements, I think there is something useful about it. It identifies different bodies of knowledge. So what I'm perhaps reacting negatively towards is instead the perceived need to express some form of authority in order to have an opinion. Another question, do I have a body of knowledge that comes through the work I make and the research that I do? I tried to explain this last year using the idea of a feedback loop, where the loop was essentially me talking to myself. I began to describe what I did as a series of overlapping loops. I was in dialogue with myself, but the signal was always coming back a little bit distorted, and it was evolving. Sometimes the wires would cross, sometimes the contextual field would change the work. It was all about learning, figuring out. This was my effort at giving some sort of visual element to what we might call practice-based research. When working on my residency at the start of the year, Charlie, who has spoken earlier tonight, and I conversed over an email game of chess. Something that came up was the distinction between our self and our communicated self. Perhaps that's where the noise comes in. There's a distortion. Maybe it's easier to read the feedback when we can compartmentalize it under definitions. But as much as I think that there's some truth to this bottom diagram here, it feels as though I'm again scratching at something that doesn't need to be or simply can't be resolved. Can I define design as a body of knowledge? I think I most often use the term design due to its convenience. At some point there was some kind of consensus to describe an amorphous body of activities and objects as design, when in fact design as we know it is a kind of a hybrid in itself, composed of many different disciplines: typography, painting, administration, advertising, printmaking, etc. Perhaps this is why even though we know that design is hard to even though we know what design actually is, it's hard to pinpoint it, in itself is a grey area. And perhaps this is why we can apply the term to other works produced by non-designers. A lot of disciplines seem like they are splitting apart and moving between things. And isn't that just the way that things go? I think that definitions are useful if it's only to shift the context that we do, whatever it may be. And how I work is more of a reaction to the amorphous perceived context, but also remembering that I myself am creating that context at the same time. It's a kind of a mix of the coincidental, self-created, and locational. So you can see how it's always changing. The spinning, the constructing, the viewing, it's always changing. Ain't that just the way that things go? On my walk, I came across a few of these newspaper boxes. I scribbled down on my photo that this could be a way of distributing residency work. I was feeling hesitant towards the idea of a gallery show, and boxes presented a new space over which I could escape some of the prior knowledge associated with exhibiting. Admittedly, the box does come with connotations attached, but these boxes don't have the weighty discourse already surrounding them. The box is freed from cemented feet, and I can thus control its location. I can control its publishing discourse. This box is all about controlling the space and the language. So we bought two from Go Plastics in Georgia. We named it Liminal Library Space, stuck vinyl on it, and are ready to set it loose once this weather is cool. So to close off this talk and to lead into any questions that you might have, I'll say this. How we define what we do does shape the work that we produce, and this can be from an internal or external sense. One can use the definitions to play with the context of the work, or they can place a prior context onto work. I think it's important to maintain momentum, keep spinning. It's easy to forget what you are when you're picking up threads. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe I'm more myself when I'm not something defined. Any questions?
It's pretty amazing how many topics we discussed previously that you had distilled already before, like the idea of design being a gray area, the idea of internal versus external momentum. It's interesting to, like, initially I was like, maybe this should have come at the beginning, but it makes so much more sense for it to come at the end. Yeah. So no question, just comment. And thank you.
Thank you. Cool.
It does feel kind of like in the panels there were a lot of things that were loose ends that people were like, I don't really know, and I feel like you kind of very well tied them together and kind of came up with a more concrete reasoning versus everyone kind of bouncing things off and being unsure. So that was kind of a very nice closing to that.
I'm curious about the functional, I don't know what you call this thing, the newspaper holders. Do they have a proper name? What is the proper name?
I don't think that's something.
Yeah,
Some
the
people call it the
doohickey, the doohat. I'm curious, and I wonder if you thought about this, placing them in different places and almost having that object in its distribution, its intent change when it's existing in a space like this, which is much more functional due to its environment, versus placing it on a street where it's much more functional, or placing it in a white cube of a gallery where the object becomes an art piece.
Yeah, we've got two boxes made the exact same. One of them's going to stay here, I think, for the moment, and the next one we're going to place out probably by the Logan Square Blue Line stop. And I think it's quite, originally I wanted this thing just to be like something that was out there on the 606, so it was kind of interacting with the public space. It was local content made for the local people, made in a place that was like easily accessible, free. And I wanted to have this kind of like chance encounter with the object, something that like maybe more like a Joe Public would access. And I can see like how it being here is catering towards a very specific kind of person who comes in through the Sun office or through to the theatre. And I think that, yeah, like I agree. Like there's definitely something interesting in that. Something that I definitely want to like play with. But yeah, like we're just still starting out for that one.
Yeah, even neighborhoods as well too, about how it can exist
Yeah.
in different neighborhoods versus the political sense of just Bucktown in general or Bloomsbury.
I was thinking about the flag contest and contest, that's an interesting word, contest in there. But and the idea how technology removes the idea of folk, so to speak, because I never thought of folk design before, but then there's, you know, sign painters and circus banner makers and tattoo artists. There's a whole history of folk design that I never considered before. But once you like nobody ever considers a karaoke folk singing, or nobody ever, you know. So once you get into, I don't know if the laser beam kiwi was, you know, made out of construction paper, maybe then it would be folk art. But if it was done, you know, on a computer, once you get on the computer, that idea of folk seems to just disappear.
Yeah, it was interesting. There were like quite a few just hand-drawn ones, but these were always made by people that we'd conceive as like a child or someone who was an amateur to the extreme sense. And all the ones that were like chosen by the panel were constructed in computer processors, you're right. I don't know if that's just like the nature of the thing, and the way that you had to, you couldn't like submit a paper design flag or like an actual material flag. You had to submit a certain size JPEG or PNG, what have you. Yeah, I don't really know how much that changed the design process, but I do think, and this is something that I actually think about a lot from my own work, is whether the tools that I'm using actually kind of shape the way that the things that I make look. And I use this quite a lot in some design projects that I do for a gallery back home, where things like there's a very specific kind of dotted line that you can make in InDesign, and I can see that a lot nowadays in a lot of people's work, and I'm like thinking that are these things kind of affecting the visual language and the discourse of design based on the fact that they come out through the tools themselves. Yeah, and I admit that in the kind of 3 flag designs that I submitted, that I made at 5 a.m. in the morning, I forgot that we're a day behind New Zealand. And so, so at 4 a.m. in the morning, I was on InDesign, and yes, my ones did have very set lines made in InDesign. Yeah.
I'm really thankful for the reminder that your presentation just gave to this whole event. That we are really vulnerable on some level to when we acknowledge that we're kind of born into a time and place, right, in history. And I in a really kind of narcissistic way, think we've been born into a really complicated point. I'm sure everyone has said that throughout time. But the fact that I think even that image, I'm sad that it kind of went away, but this kind of, even in multiple slides you showed, this kind of idea that we're fractured on some level because of what's happened over the last 100, 200 years, I think is really relevant to the discussion. You know, and I'm reminded that I struggle with that. I struggle with that wholeheartedly, in a sense of like, where's my identity? Where am I placed? You know, what am I gonna do with this time? You know, and I think that's, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool.
Great.
Oh.
Yeah, I just have one more thing. Sorry. I'm curious to your thoughts on why I kind of see the general consensus of capital D designers desire to simplify and a capital A artist desire to complicate, and sort of the critique that designers usually get when they pull a complicated meaning for a decision that they make. Like, for example, I see a lot of critique for the process of a logo design, and there's bunches of grids and circles and like there's paragraphs and paragraphs of explaining, and it's called as bullshit, versus an artist, if an artist just says, oh, I made it because, you know, one sentence, then it's like, that's called bullshit. So I'm just curious to why you think that's the case.
I'm not entirely sure, I don't know if I can say, but I often feel like design is a very focused, and this is what I've been struggling with for this event, is why design talks are less interesting than artist talks, and why there seems to be a different value placed on words. And I often feel like in design the focus is towards the final thing or the end point, but in art it's kind of reversed, and the focus is towards the process. And I don't know if that there's some sort of shift in there that means that there's a different kind of need to explain your work in a different way. But I feel like it comes out of there. Yeah.
And there's a rich history to why I think that happened in art anyway, and I think it was a building desire to see an acknowledgement in the work itself of where it come from.
Yeah.
Who is saying so. This is the postmodern thing, right? The strategy in general was to point and acknowledge that there's no neutrality, right? And I'm not sure, I don't know well enough if design has confronted that wholeheartedly as a something that they've tackled as a discipline or as I don't know, or as a field, but in art it's really played out, right? And maybe even exhaustively so, where artists, the lashback has been stop making me justify and contextualize and acknowledge everything. But that was a big fight for 40, 50 years in the art world. Thing.
It's also, design, a lot of it comes to, even in the education system, it's about defending your work. It's about justifying every single decision you make and pushing out subjectivity as much as possible. Which I find problematic in a lot of sense, because subjectivity is the most human, natural thing. Which is, it's weird. Where I find it interesting, because again, it's not what you said about it's all about the endpoint, especially designer talks. A lot is about a show and tell portfolio thing, where because it's so wrapped up in the commercial practices as well, it's the success is quantifiable by how many sales or how many looks it got on Facebook, or how many whatever. So it comes about justifying success purely based on this quantifiable statistics a lot of times. And it's never about well, where do you come from as a designer? Where were you born? What shaped you to be the person you are to make this thing? That's supposed to be a totally separate thing. Whereas in art, it's not relevant. You're supposed to be an invisible force that created this thing that stands autonomously from you, and that doesn't belong to you once it's out of your hands.
If you look at the history of what brought about abstraction, that's a rich fight here, that I think that testifies to why acknowledgement came about so heavily in art, where conceptual art comes from.
Yeah,
That's a really cool history.
to some extent, a lot of people think design is successful based on the reaction of the client or the users that interact with it. And once you start showing the details of how you came up with those things, then all of a sudden you kind of see behind the scenes of the work that goes into it. And that's something that I think a lot of times you kind of try to hide working in a commercial setting. Is it needs to look perfect and clean and well done, and once you show this process, then it's almost some sort of insecurity that is not supposed to be shown and then gets criticized.
I think art's like that too, for sure.
Maybe it's
creating this
self-evident or something.
Yeah. Well, I keep on thinking about definition versus dialogue of design in a broad term is you're trying to define something, where art is trying to create a discussion around something, which again, there's overlap in both, but it's kind of an interesting jumping off point. But that's a great question. That's a great dinner conversation, rolling us right into it, right?
Yeah, we close it out. I know we're getting hungry.
So we're gonna head over to Drinking Bird, which is around the corner on Webster and Clybourne. If we want to start caravanning over there, I am gonna close up shop here with you all over there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.